It was a bright, clear afternoon in Willowbrook Park, a picturesque green space nestled in the heart of Montgomery, Colorado. The air carried the light scent of blooming cherry blossoms, and the gentle rustling of leaves provided a soothing backdrop to the sounds of laughter, distant joggers' footsteps, and children's excited squeals as they raced each other across the playground. Among the park visitors, Celeste Vaughn, a well-respected civil rights attorney, sat on a weathered wooden bench near the pond, the sun casting a soft golden glow on her as she turned the pages of a thick, well-loved legal tome. For Celeste, moments like these were rare. Her work at Vaughn and Ellis LLP consumed most of her days, leaving little time for leisure. Yet today, she had carved out an hour for herself, hoping to enjoy a peaceful afternoon with a good book. Clad in dark wash jeans, a crisp white blouse, and a tan trench coat draped over her shoulders, she exuded a quiet elegance, one that spoke of both confidence and resilience. Her dark curls framed her face, and a pair of reading glasses perched on the bridge of her nose. She was entirely absorbed in her book when the sudden screech of tires shattered the serenity. A black and white police cruiser came to a sharp halt just a few feet from where she sat. The noise drew the attention of several onlookers, who turned their heads toward the source of the disturbance. Two uniformed officers, Sergeant Greg Munson and Officer Brian Holt, stepped out of the vehicle, their movements brisk and calculated. Their sharp eyes scanned the area before landing squarely on Celeste, the only black woman sitting alone in the vicinity. "Ma'am, may we speak with you for a moment?" Sergeant Munson's voice carried across the park, his tone laced with an air of authority that suggested more command than request. Celeste looked up, momentarily disoriented by the sudden intrusion. She adjusted her glasses and closed her book with deliberate care before meeting Munson's gaze. "Of course, officer. Is there a problem?" The younger of the two officers, Officer Holt, took a step forward, his stance rigid. "We got a call about some suspicious activity in the area. Mind telling us what you're doing here?" Celeste blinked, confused. She glanced around, noting the families and joggers nearby, none of whom appeared remotely suspicious. "Suspicious activity?" she repeated, her voice calm but firm. "I'm sitting here, reading my book. Is that considered suspicious now?" Munson exchanged a glance with Holt before shifting his weight. "Can we see some ID?" he asked, his voice carrying the weight of expectation rather than inquiry. Celeste felt the muscles in her shoulders tighten, but she maintained her composure. "I'm sorry, but may I ask why? Have I committed a crime?" "It's just routine," Holt interjected, though his tone made it clear that this wasn't routine at all. A murmur rippled through the growing number of parkgoers who had taken an interest in the unfolding scene. Some exchanged uncomfortable glances, while others subtly reached for their phones, sensing that something was off about this exchange. Celeste exhaled slowly, debating her next move. She knew her rights inside and out, but she also knew that refusing their request outright would only escalate the situation. With measured movements, she reached into her bag and retrieved her wallet, sliding her driver's license out and handing it over. Sergeant Munson took it, examining it with unnecessary scrutiny. His lips pursed slightly as he read the name. "Celeste Vaughn," he said, almost mockingly. "What brings you to this part of town, Ms. Vaughn?" She inhaled deeply, keeping her voice steady. "I live here. I came to the park to read. Is that a problem?" Munson's expression remained unreadable as he handed her ID back. But instead of walking away, he lingered, his eyes scanning her face as though looking for a reason to push further. "Do you always carry a book like that around?" Holt asked, his tone laced with thinly veiled condescension. Celeste frowned. "Excuse me?" "Just seems unusual is all," Munson added, crossing his arms. "Are you alone here, or waiting for someone?" A new tension settled between them, the kind Celeste had encountered countless times before in courtrooms, deposition rooms, and civil rights cases she had fought. The power dynamic was glaringly clear. Two armed officers using intimidation tactics against an unarmed woman whose only offense was existing in a public space. She straightened her posture. "I'm not answering any more questions unless you tell me what I'm being accused of," she said, her voice firm but composed. Her refusal seemed to ignite something in them. "Don't get smart with us," Holt snapped, stepping closer. "We're just doing our job." "And I know the law," Celeste countered, her pulse steady but her heart pounding. "I'm not breaking it by sitting in a public park." But reason was not on their agenda. Munson suddenly reached for her arm, his grip tight. "You're resisting," he said, though she hadn't moved an inch. Celeste's breath hitched. "What are you doing? Let go of me." The murmurs in the crowd turned into hushed exclamations. Someone pulled out their phone, hitting record. A young woman near the playground held up her device, her face contorted with disbelief. "Stop resisting," Munson barked, his voice louder this time, performing for the audience now forming around them. Before Celeste could fully process what was happening, cold metal snapped around her wrists. The unmistakable weight of the handcuffs sent a wave of humiliation crashing over her. The officers hauled her toward the police cruiser, ignoring the growing chorus of voices questioning their actions. Celeste turned her head one last time, locking eyes with the woman holding up her phone. For a fleeting moment, a silent exchange passed between them. "Document this. Don't let this go unnoticed." And then the car doors slammed shut behind her. Celeste Vaughn, a decorated civil rights attorney, had just been arrested for existing in a park. But this wasn't the end of her story. It was only the beginning. The drive to the Willowbrook police station was suffocating, a silence filled with unspoken words and an undeniable imbalance of power. The only sounds in the police cruiser were the distant crackle of the radio and the steady hum of the engine. Celeste Vaughn sat in the back seat, her wrists still bound in the cold metal cuffs, her fingers numb from how tightly they had been secured. Through the window, the city blurred past her, a city she had spent years fighting for, representing clients wrongfully accused, defending civil liberties, ensuring justice was upheld. And yet, here she was, caught in the very system she had sworn to hold accountable. The irony stung, but not as much as the growing sense of humiliation pooling in her chest. When they arrived, Officer Holt yanked the door open. "Let's go," he ordered. Celeste refused to let them see her pain. She squared her shoulders, stepped out with as much dignity as possible, and walked through the station doors, her hands shackled, but her resolve unshaken. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed, casting a harsh glow over the booking area. Officers moved with robotic efficiency, barely glancing at her as they processed other detainees. But a few recognized her. Some had seen her on the news, others had faced her in court when she defended clients against police misconduct cases. Their eyes flickered with a mixture of recognition and unease, but no one spoke. Munson and Holt led her to the fingerprinting station, where a sergeant with graying hair took her hands roughly, rolling her fingertips across the ink pad. "What's the charge?" the sergeant asked, without looking up. "Resisting arrest and obstructing an officer," Munson replied casually, as though reading off a menu. Celeste bit the inside of her cheek, swallowing the anger bubbling inside her. "You sure about that?" the sergeant muttered, glancing up for the first time. His eyes lingered on Celeste, something unreadable in his expression. She held his gaze, daring him to acknowledge the truth. But instead, he sighed, pressing her hand against a piece of paper. The mugshot was next. "Face forward," the officer behind the camera said, his voice devoid of emotion. Celeste lifted her chin. She refused to look defeated. The camera flashed, capturing an image she knew would be a permanent stain in a system designed to crush people like her. After the formalities, she was led to a small holding cell, the metal bars slamming shut behind her. The walls were painted a dull beige, the bench cold and unwelcoming. Her body ached, but she refused to sit down just yet. She stood there, arms crossed, staring at the door, her mind racing through every legal strategy she had ever learned. Minutes turned into hours. Then, finally, footsteps. A young officer, barely out of training, approached the cell with a clipboard. "Ms. Vaughn," he said hesitantly, "you've been charged." Celeste's fingers curled into fists. "On what grounds?" The officer hesitated, but then repeated the same line she had heard before. "You can discuss that in court." Celeste closed her eyes for a moment, then exhaled. Fine. If that's how they wanted to play it, then that's exactly what she would do. Discuss it in court. Only this time, she would be the one leading the charge. Celeste sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by a sea of legal pads, open law books, and scattered notes filled with scribbled arguments. The quiet hum of the city outside her window was a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside her mind. She had spent years building her reputation, dedicating herself to justice and fairness, only to find herself on the receiving end of the very system she had fought against. The injustice of it burned in her chest like a smoldering fire, but she wasn't about to let it consume her. She pressed her fingers against her temples, inhaling deeply before flipping open another legal text. If the officers thought she would simply accept what happened, if they assumed she would let their abuse of power go unchecked, they had gravely underestimated the wrong woman. Her arrest had sent shockwaves through the community. The video taken by the young woman in the park had gone viral, spreading across social media like wildfire. Thousands of people had shared it, demanding accountability. People she had never met before were sending messages of support, offering legal assistance, resources, and even financial backing. She wasn't alone in this fight, but the weight of expectation was overwhelming. "This is bigger than just me," she murmured under her breath, tapping her pen against the table. She knew that for every case like hers that gained traction, hundreds more happened in the shadows, buried under legal bureaucracy, dismissed or forgotten. If she had been treated this way, a respected attorney, a woman who knew her rights, how much worse was it for those who didn't have the same knowledge or platform? The thought made her grip her pen tighter. Not this time. Her phone vibrated, breaking her focus. "Marissa?" Celeste hesitated before answering. "You've been working for hours," Marissa said immediately, the concern in her voice unmistakable. "I know you, Cel. You're gonna burn yourself out before this case even goes to trial." Celeste rubbed her tired eyes. "I don't have a choice, Mar. The department is going to fight this with everything they've got. They'll delay, obstruct, twist the narrative however they can. If I don't come prepared, if I don't win, they'll use this case as an excuse to justify their actions. They'll paint me as a hostile suspect instead of the victim of racial profiling and abuse of power." Marissa sighed. "I get it. Believe me, I do. But this isn't just about proving a legal point. It's about change. And you can't fight for change if you're running on fumes." Celeste leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes for a brief moment. She knew Marissa was right, but the relentless drive in her chest wouldn't let her stop. She opened her laptop and clicked on the video. It had been replayed on news stations across the country, analyzed by legal experts, debated by activists. Watching herself on screen, calm, composed, yet relentlessly targeted, was surreal. The officers had treated her like she didn't belong, like her presence in that park was something to be interrogated rather than accepted. And then, the moment that still sent fury coursing through her veins, the unnecessary handcuffs, the staged resisting arrest claim, the blatant disregard for her dignity. She wouldn't let it slide. That night, she finalized her lawsuit. A civil rights case against the officers and the department for unlawful detainment, racial profiling, and abuse of power. Every word, every line of legal argument was sharpened to a razor's edge. By morning, the official filing had been submitted, and the battle had begun. As news of Celeste's lawsuit spread, the ripple effect was undeniable. What had started as a single moment of injustice, a peaceful afternoon at the park turned into an arrest, had evolved into something much larger. It was no longer just her fight. It was a fight that belonged to every person who had ever been unfairly targeted, dismissed, or silenced. People from all over the city and even beyond began to rally around her case. Protesters gathered outside the police department, holding signs that read, "Justice for Celeste, End Racial Profiling, and We Demand Accountability." Civil rights groups stepped in, offering resources, legal support, and media outreach. Local activists organized town halls, urging residents to speak out about their own encounters with law enforcement abuse. And the stories poured in. A retired teacher recounted being stopped on her morning walk because she matched a description. A young father described being thrown against his car in front of his son, accused of stealing his own vehicle. A small business owner, despite living in the neighborhood for over a decade, had been asked to prove he belonged there. Celeste listened to every story. She attended meetings, standing alongside the people who had suffered in silence for too long. Though exhausted from her own battle, she knew that this case wasn't just about what happened to her, it was about exposing the systemic issues that allowed it to keep happening. One evening, as she was leaving a community gathering, a woman approached her hesitantly. She was in her late 50s, her eyes filled with a mixture of admiration and sadness. "Miss Carter," she said softly. Celeste turned, offering a warm but tired smile. "Yes?" The woman hesitated, then reached for Celeste's hand. "I just wanted to say thank you for fighting back, for showing them we won't stay silent anymore." Celeste felt her throat tighten. This wasn't just a legal case, it was a moment of reckoning. A realization that the fight wasn't hers alone, but one she had the privilege of leading. The pressure was immense. The police department issued a public statement, denying any wrongdoing, but claiming they would review their procedures. The mayor's office avoided taking sides, insisting that the legal process should run its course. Meanwhile, conservative news outlets tried to spin the narrative, painting Celeste as an angry attorney looking for a payday. But the truth was already out there. The video, the eyewitness accounts, the patterns that had been exposed, and no amount of damage control could erase what people had seen with their own eyes. Celeste knew that the fight was far from over, but she also knew one thing for certain: she wasn't fighting alone. Celeste had spent the last few weeks fighting relentlessly, pouring every ounce of her energy into her lawsuit, standing alongside the community, and pushing for accountability. She barely slept, and when she did, her dreams were filled with fragments of that humiliating day in the park. The flash of the handcuffs, the cold glare of the officers, the feeling of complete powerlessness in a system she had spent her life upholding. But fate had other plans. Her attorney, Mark Reynolds, had called her one morning with an unexpected update. "You might want to sit down for this," he said, his voice laced with something between disbelief and amusement. Celeste, sitting at her desk surrounded by stacks of case files, pinched the bridge of her nose. "Mark, I don't have time for theatrics." "What is it?" Mark exhaled sharply. "You've been assigned to oversee a misconduct hearing." She frowned. And the defendants are officers Greer and Lawson." Celeste sat completely still, the weight of those words sinking in. The officers who had humiliated her, arrested her without cause, and treated her like a criminal in front of dozens of witnesses were now standing trial for excessive force in another case. And she, as a judge, would decide their fate. For a brief moment, she felt the sharp pull of emotion. Rage, vindication, the desire for retribution. Then she forced herself to breathe. This wasn't about revenge. She had spent her career upholding the law, fighting for fairness, and ensuring justice was served without bias. Now, more than ever, she had to practice what she preached. The day of the hearing, the courtroom was packed. Word had spread quickly about the case, and now people sat shoulder to shoulder, whispering in hushed voices. Some were there to see justice. Others simply wanted to witness the incredible irony of it all. At the defense table, officers Greer and Lawson sat in their uniforms, looking markedly different from the men who had dragged her away in handcuffs weeks ago. Greer's confidence had visibly cracked. Lawson, normally the more composed of the two, kept fidgeting with his tie. They both knew. Then, the courtroom doors opened and Celeste entered. She moved with purpose, her black robe flowing behind her. She didn't look at the officers immediately, though she could feel their stares. Instead, she took her seat at the bench, adjusted her papers, and then, finally, met their eyes. The reaction was instantaneous. Greer's face drained of color, his jaw clenched as he struggled to mask his shock. Lawson's hand twitched where it rested on the table, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed hard. Celeste let the moment stretch, allowing them to truly process what was happening. Then, with measured authority, she picked up her gavel and said, "This court is now in session. Please be seated." The murmurs in the gallery ceased. The officers sat stiffly, their posture suddenly too straight, as if trying to regain control of the situation. But Celeste knew the truth. Control had already slipped through their fingers. As the hearing began, she maintained her professionalism, listening to the arguments carefully. The case itself was damning. The officers had been accused of unnecessary use of force against an unarmed civilian, a young man named Jordan Bailey. The prosecution had video evidence, eyewitness testimony, and a history of complaints filed against both men. Celeste remained impartial, but she couldn't ignore the parallels between Jordan's case and her own. The same dismissive arrogance, the same abuse of authority, the same lack of accountability, until now. Every so often, she would glance at the defendants. They avoided her gaze. During a recess, Greer and Lawson stood in the hallway with their attorney, whispering frantically. Celeste could hear the panic in their voices, though they tried to keep their conversation quiet. "How the hell is this happening?" Greer hissed. "How is she the judge?" "This has to be a setup," Lawson muttered, shaking his head. Their lawyer, a man named Donald Avery, sighed. "It's not a setup. It's a coincidence, and you need to focus. She's not the enemy here, your actions are." Celeste overheard every word, but she didn't react. She simply walked past them and re-entered the courtroom, resuming her place at the bench. As the testimony continued, the weight of their past actions finally seemed to sink in. Jordan Bailey, the young man they had assaulted, took the stand. His voice trembled as he described the night he was thrown to the ground without warning, accused of resisting arrest when he had done nothing wrong. "They already made up their minds before they even spoke to me," Jordan said, his hands clenched in his lap. "I could see it in their eyes." Celeste knew exactly what he meant. The prosecution's case was airtight. The defense, however, struggled. Greer and Lawson's attorney tried to justify their actions, but the evidence was overwhelming. By the end of the day, it was clear. They were guilty. Celeste adjourned the hearing, her voice steady as she said, "We will reconvene tomorrow at 9 a.m. As people shuffled out of the courtroom, Greer and Lawson lingered. They hesitated, clearly debating whether to approach her. In the end, they didn't. They left quietly, their steps heavy, their arrogance shattered. And for the first time, Celeste saw something in their expressions she never thought she would: regret. The next morning, the courtroom was more crowded than before. News of the ironic twist of fate had spread, drawing more spectators eager to witness the next stage of the hearing. Some came out of curiosity, others out of hope. Hope that real justice would finally be served. Celeste entered with the same measured grace as before, her robe flowing as she ascended to the bench. She glanced briefly at the rows of spectators, recognizing familiar faces from the community, people who had suffered under a system that too often failed them. Among them sat Jordan Bailey, the young man at the heart of the case, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. She could feel the weight of their expectations, but she had long learned how to carry it. The attorneys wasted no time diving into their closing arguments. "The role of law enforcement is to protect and serve," the prosecutor stated firmly, addressing the jury. "But when officers abuse their power, they become the very threat they are sworn to defend us from." Celeste listened intently as the prosecutor methodically laid out the evidence, reminding the court of the video footage, the excessive force, and the unjustified aggression that had led to Jordan's injuries. The facts were undeniable, and the prosecutor made it clear. This was not just a misjudgment, it was a pattern of abuse. Then the defense took their turn. "Your Honor," their attorney began, his voice measured but strained, "while we acknowledge the unfortunate circumstances, we ask the court to consider the difficult nature of law enforcement. Officers Greer and Lawson were simply making split-second decisions in a high-pressure situation." Celeste remained impassive, her pen gliding across her notepad. She had heard these arguments before. Excuses, not accountability. When it was time for the officers to speak, Greer hesitated. He stole a glance at Celeste, his face pale and tense. I made a mistake," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Looking back, I should have handled things differently." It was the closest thing to an apology Celeste had heard from him. But it wasn't enough. The arguments concluded, and the room fell silent as everyone awaited the ruling. Celeste took a deep breath. This wasn't just about two officers. This was about setting a precedent. A message that no one, no matter their badge or title, was above the law. The courtroom was silent as Celeste returned to deliver her ruling. Every seat was filled, the tension almost tangible. Reporters lined the back wall, pens poised, cameras ready. This was no longer just a case about two officers. It had become a symbol of a larger fight for justice and accountability. Celeste's voice was calm but firm as she began. The role of law enforcement is to protect and serve with integrity, respect, and fairness, she stated. When that trust is violated, it erodes the very foundation of our justice system. She turned her gaze toward the defendants. Officers Greer and Lawson sat stiffly at the defense table, their expressions grim. The weight of what was coming hung over them like a storm cloud. The evidence has demonstrated that you acted with unnecessary force, disregarding the protocols you were sworn to uphold, Celeste continued. Your actions were not only unjustified, but indicative of a troubling pattern that must be addressed. The courtroom remained dead still as she delivered the consequences: mandatory suspension without pay, extensive retraining, and a formal disciplinary record that would follow them throughout their careers. She struck the gavel with finality. This court is adjourned. As the officers stood to leave, Greer hesitated. He turned back, his voice barely above a whisper. Your Honor, I'm sorry. Celeste met his gaze, but she didn't respond. Change was measured by actions, not words. Later that evening, she stood outside the courthouse watching a group of young activists gather. The fight for justice was far from over. But today was a step forward. Justice is not simply about punishment. It is about accountability, fairness, and the courage to stand against wrongdoing, no matter how powerful the opposition. Celeste's journey reminds us that standing up for what is right is rarely easy, but it is always necessary. Her battle was not just for herself, but for the countless others who had been silenced, dismissed, or made to feel powerless. In a world where authority can be misused, where respect is often given based on status rather than integrity, we must remember that true justice is built on actions, not words. For those who have lived long enough to see history repeat itself, this story is a reminder that change is always possible, even when it seems slow. Every voice, every moment of defiance against injustice, adds to the tide of transformation, whether through speaking out, supporting those who fight for fairness, or simply refusing to turn a blind eye. We all play a role in shaping a more just world. Courage, resilience, and unwavering principles, these are the true marks of strength, not wealth or power. Because in the end, real justice is about leaving behind a world where future generations no longer have to fight the same battles.